The summer of 1680 was not a season, it was a wait. Madrid baked under a white, merciless sun, the kind that bleached the sky into a sheet of bone and drove shadows deep into the cracks of stone. Inside the sprawling Alcazar Palace, the air did not move. Curtains hung limp, candles warped in the heat, and the stone floors radiated the stored breath of long days. The scent of lavender water drifted through the corridors, mingling with rose oil and powdered iris, as if the entire palace were preparing for a feast of flowers. But beneath the sweet perfume, something else lingered, a darker note, one that could not be named in polite company, though everyone recognized it. It was the smell of rot, not the open, brutal stench of death, but something older and more insidious, damp mildew clinging to velvet, fish scales left to dry in the heat. It was a scent that seeped into the plaster, wove itself into the hems of skirts, and lingered long after its source had passed. That source was Princess Margarita Teresa of Spain. She moved along the shadowed corridor now, her silk skirts brushing the flagstones, her slippers making no sound. Sunlight from the high windows fractured across her jewels, emeralds at her throat, pearls braided into her dark hair. Her face was pale, powdered, and motionless. Her posture was perfect. Every detail was the performance expected of her, a daughter of the House of Habsburg. But the courtiers who lined the hall did not see only her. They smelled her first. They turned their heads subtly as she passed, as though admiring the gilded molding or the tapestry on the opposite wall. Painted fans lifted like pale wings to cover noses. A few caught unprepared, blinked hard, their eyes watering. The whispers came next, soft enough to seem like the murmur of the air, but sharp enough to cut. Her Royal Highness is coming. It was not a statement of reverence anymore. It was a warning. A lady-in-waiting, hearing the announcement from further down the corridor, reached for the crystal flask at her hip and sprayed a fine mist of rosewater into the air. The droplets caught the light like 1,000 tiny stars, but they did nothing to banish the underlying odor. At 19, Margarita Teresa carried with her the cruel gift of her bloodline. The royal physicians gave it no single name. They called it a symptom, a manifestation, an affliction. In truth, it was the echo of hundreds of years of marriages between uncles and nieces, between cousins, between those who shared more than a family crest. The Habsburgs called it blood purity. History would call it something else. Her scent was not the only inheritance. Her face bore the jawline that had become the family's heraldry as much as their coat of arms. Wide, protruding, heavy-lipped. Her skin, fine as parchment, bruised at the slightest touch. She suffered spells of weakness that left her leaning on her ladies for support. And yet, in the dark mathematics of royal life, she was still considered an asset, still considered valuable enough to be paraded before ambassadors, dressed in gold, her hair brushed until it shone like spun glass. In the shadows of the corridor, a man watched her pass. Diego Velázquez, the court painter, older now, his eyes heavy with the weight of decades. He had painted kings and queens, victories and coronations, and he had watched this family's beauty wither from his canvases year after year. He knew the smell that followed the princess, though he would never record it in oils. His paintings showed the ceremonial grandeur, the velvets and jewels, the impossible dignity demanded of them. But beneath each brushstroke lay another image only he could see. The thinning hair, the pallid skin, the strange swellings of joints, the slow tightening of generations in the bones. He had heard the court physician Luis Mercado speak of this, not in public, never in public, but in the hushed privacy of the sick room. Mercado had called it the price of blood purity. Velázquez remembered the words as clearly as if they had been painted in red on the corridor wall. The corridor seemed to stretch forever, a tunnel of tapestries depicting victories long past. Battles won when the Habsburg blood was still strong, Faces in the woven threads, sharp-eyed kings, proud queens, seemed to watch Margarita as she passed, their expressions unreadable. Perhaps they disapproved. Perhaps they pitied. In the kitchens below, the palace's older cook, Maria, stirred a steaming pot. Rosemary and thyme bubbled in the broth, releasing a green, earthy scent. She ladled it into a smaller vessel and crushed more herbs into a paste. It was the latest remedy for the princess's smell. "Poor girl," she muttered, not unkindly. "It's not her fault she was born like this." The door to the kitchen burst open. The high steward entered, red-faced from the heat. "Hurry with that," he said sharply. "Her Highness is about to receive the French ambassador." Maria wiped her hands, poured the herbal mixture into a porcelain jar, and sent it away with a servant. She knew, as did everyone, that it would make little difference. Upstairs, the French ambassador, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis of Torcy, waited in the audience chamber. He had the cool, assessing gaze of a man who understood that information was as valuable as gold. Every detail he observed would soon be in a letter to King Louis XIV. The princess's appearance, her health, the way she carried herself, and yes, the smell. France and Spain were allies by necessity, rivals by instinct. Weakness was not merely a private matter, it was a bargaining chip. Margarita paused before the heavy double doors of the audience hall. Two ladies adjusted the folds of her gown, smoothed her hair, and reapplied a dusting of powder to her cheeks. The air was thick with scent now, so dense it almost shimmered. She closed her eyes, drew in a breath that carried both lavender and something darker, and opened them again with the practiced poise of a Habsburg princess. "Let him in," she said when the chamberlain asked if she was ready. The doors opened. Light from the hall spilled over her, catching the green of her gown, the gold of her necklace. She stepped forward into the gaze of the ambassador. Her smile was perfect. Her back was straight, and the scent followed her into the room like a second invisible presence. The meeting would be polite, ceremonial. The ambassador would bow, the princess would curtsy, and the court would pretend that nothing unusual lingered in the air. But outside the chamber, in the long corridors of the Alcazar, the truth could not be hidden. The perfume was a mask. The rot was real. And as Margarita retreated to her rooms, another figure, her younger brother Carlos, sat in the far wing of the palace, hunched over a book he could not read. His life, like hers, was already shaped by the same inheritance, the same purity, the same poison. The corridors of the Alcazar were heavy not only with lavender, but with the scent of a dynasty beginning to die. And yet, the palace did not change its rituals. The perfumers kept working. The cooks kept brewing remedies. The court kept smiling for ambassadors. The scent was always there, but it was only the first sign. Soon the air itself would feel like it was thickening, heavy not just with perfume, but with dread. The palace smelled of work, not the work of carpenters or soldiers, but the work of perfumers, a labor as obsessive and desperate as any military campaign. In the cramped rooms behind the audience chambers, men in embroidered aprons crushed herbs beneath brass pestles, the rhythmic thud echoing against the tiled walls. Copper pots steamed gently over low flames, their contents an alchemist's dream and nightmare. Rosemary for cleansing, thyme for strength, vinegar for cutting through stubborn odors. Into the brew went crushed lavender, rose petals, orange blossom, and musk, scraped from the glands of deer. The air was heavy with these scents, a heady mixture that clung to skin and cloth alike. And yet, beneath it all, the other smell remained, stubborn, unmovable. It was a shadow smell, something that waited patiently beneath layers of sweetness. You could almost believe it was gone, until you breathed in a little deeper. The stench returned as it always did. The perfumers knew the truth, though they would never speak it aloud. This was not a scent that could be banished by any known oil or essence. It did not come from sweat, from unwashed linen, or from poor hygiene. It came from within. It lived in the blood. Princess Margarita Teresa could bathe twice a day, could drape herself in the most luxurious silks, could wear the costliest perfumes from Venice or Florence, and still it would come. The odor seeped through her skin, as if her body were exhaling centuries of corruption. The ladies who dressed her learned the ritual of disguise. First, a dusting of fine rice powder to dry the skin. Then a thin layer of pomade scented with bergamot and clove. Over this, layers of perfume applied to the pulse points, behind the ears, at the hollow of the throat, inside the wrists. Finally, sachets of dried herbs stitched discreetly into the folds of her gown, so that with every movement, she released a soft cloud of floral fragrance. It was an art, but an art that never fooled those who looked too closely. The French ambassador noticed. Of course he did. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis of Torcy, was not a man to miss such details. He had been sent to Madrid with instructions to report on everything, from the political temper of the court to the health of its royal family. His eyes lingered on Margarita a moment longer than was polite. His nostrils flared just slightly. Later, in his private chambers, he dipped his quill into ink and began to write. Her Highness bears herself with grace, but there is a certain malodor which even the finest perfumes cannot conceal. It is whispered among the court that this is a consequence of too much union within the family line. He did not need to elaborate further. Louis XIV would understand immediately what that meant. Weakness, not the kind measured in strength of arms, but weakness of the flesh, weakness of the blood, the sort of weakness that could topple a throne without a single battle. This was the danger, not the smell itself, but what it represented. A dynasty's enemies could sense vulnerability as sharply as a wolf smells blood. Spain's empire stretched across oceans, but its power now balanced on a fragile body. If one princess could not even hide her own illness, what did that say about the king, the heir, the future? Whispers moved through the corridors like drafts under a door. The scent was no longer merely a private embarrassment. It had become a political liability. The rot in the air was a reminder of the rot in the line. The doctors, of course, had their own way of speaking about it. In low voices, in rooms far from the ears of the court, they muttered the phrase, limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Among the Habsburgs, it was considered a virtue, a mark of divine favor. Among the learned, it was beginning to sound like a curse. For centuries, marriages had been arranged to keep the bloodline unsullied by lesser families, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin. It was politics disguised as piety, the belief that God himself had chosen their house, and that to dilute it was a sin. But nature has its own laws, and it does not bend for thrones. One court physician had dared to hint at the truth to a trusted colleague. We preserve the name, and in so doing, we destroy the body. The perfumers worked faster as the ambassador's visit approached. They boiled new mixtures, adding cinnamon and frankincense, hoping to overwhelm the other scent with sheer force. The corridors began to smell like a marketplace in some distant port. Exotic, intoxicating, almost suffocating. But even as the ambassador was ushered into the audience chamber, there were moments when the perfumes faltered, a movement of her gown, a shift in the air, and the darker smell slipped through like a shadow escaping into sunlight. He would not forget it, nor would his king. And while the court fought to conceal Margarita's condition, another shadow hung heavier over the palace. Her younger brother, Carlos. The boy was fragile in a way that went beyond sickness. His body was crooked, his movements slow, his speech thick and difficult. His tutors complained he could not focus on lessons. His attendants worried when he tried to walk too far. He tired easily, spoke rarely, and often seemed more like a child than a prince destined for a throne. If Margarita's scent was a whisper of decay. Carlos was its full chorus. The court could mask a smell. They could not mask the sight of a king who could barely stand, and yet the rituals continued. The perfumers distilled. The cooks brewed tonics. The priests prayed over relics. The Queen Mother, Mariana of Austria, presided over it all with the cold precision of someone who understood the stakes but refused to admit the truth. For the Habsburgs, appearances were everything. If the blood was pure, the throne was safe. If the throne was safe, the empire endured. But blood could not be made pure by will alone. Evening fell over Madrid, cooling the stone of the palace at last. The perfumers doused their braziers, leaving the corridors scented with the day's work. A mingling of lavender, rose, and something unspoken. In the far wing, Carlos sat by a window, watching the last light fade. His eyes followed the silhouettes of healthy children playing in the courtyard below. He did not join them. He never would. The perfumed air carried to him, faint but unmistakable. His sister was nearby. Somewhere between them hung the truth. Neither spoke. They were both pieces of the same inheritance, two bodies carrying the same hidden plague. And in the shadows, the court plotted their next performance, a wedding for Carlos, a union that might save the line, or finish it. And so, while the palace drowned itself in flowers and incense, the true work of the court began, finding a bride for the fragile heir. They would dress it as politics, as alliance, as divine duty. But behind the silks and vows lay a single, desperate hope, that the bloodline could be saved before it destroyed itself completely. The far wing of the Alcazar was quiet, too quiet for the apartments of a prince. No clattering of wooden swords, no shouts of boys at play, no quick footsteps on the stone floors. Only the slow scrape of a chair being pulled closer to a window and the faint rustle of parchment. Inside, 12-year-old Carlos, Prince of Asturias, sat hunched over a leather-bound book. The letters swam before his eyes, bending and doubling until they might as well have been foreign symbols. His tutor leaned over, voice patient but edged with fatigue. "Your Majesty, try again," the man urged, pointing to a single word. Carlos opened his mouth, but the sound that emerged was thick, distorted. His oversized tongue pressed awkwardly against his teeth, turning syllables into muddled shapes. His jaw ached. He tried again, slower this time, but the words still emerged broken. The tutor smiled faintly, hiding his disappointment, and moved on. Carlos's eyes wandered from the page, drifting toward the tall window beside him. Beyond the glass lay the palace gardens, sunlit and alive. He could see the sons of noblemen racing between hedges, climbing the stone balustrades, laughing as they chased each other toward the fountains. He had never joined them. He never would. Every movement was a negotiation with his body. His legs, bent and twisted from rickets, ached constantly. Walking any distance brought sharp pains that lingered for hours. His breath often came shallow and quick, as if some invisible cord tightened around his chest. Physicians had long ago whispered of seizures, of fevers that arrived without warning, of an internal frailty that no tonic could cure. They did not speak these words to his mother, at least not directly, but their eyes betrayed them. Mariana of Austria, regal and unyielding, chose not to see. To admit her son's weakness would be to admit something far greater, that the line she had fought to preserve was crumbling. The courtiers too avoided the subject. When they bowed to the boy prince, they saw not the fragility in his limbs, but the crown that would one day sit on his head. And for them, the solution was as old as the dynasty itself. Marry him well. The logic was simple, at least in their minds. If the boy could be wed quickly enough, the line might yet produce an heir. Purity of blood must be preserved, even if it meant ignoring the obvious. But purity in the Habsburg world no longer meant health or strength. It meant closeness. It meant keeping royal blood undiluted by outsiders, as though nobility could be measured like gold content. It meant uncles marrying nieces, cousins marrying cousins, marriages made in the same family tree's darkest, tightest branches. The result sat here now, in the dim light of a summer afternoon, struggling to read a single word. Physicians came and went from Carlos's chambers, their visits a parade of whispered Latin and clinking bottles. Some brought mineral tonics, sharp with iron and sulfur, promising to strengthen his bones. Others prescribed rich broths, heavy with marrow, meant to fortify his blood. A few placed more faith in relics than remedies, pressing saints' bones or blessed medallions into his hands. One Italian doctor, more daring than the rest, murmured to a colleague in the corridor, "The boy's body is like a fragile glass. It was blown too thin in the making." They all suspected the truth, that the prince's ailments were not the result of bad fortune, but the inevitable toll of centuries of consanguinity. But none would dare voice it to the king. Carlos himself did not understand the details, but he understood enough to know he was different. He noticed it when he tried to run, only to feel pain shoot through his legs like molten metal. He noticed it when his chest tightened and the edges of his vision darkened, forcing him to sit while others played. He noticed it when his words drew puzzled looks, as if people had to strain to make sense of them. Most of all, he noticed it in the way others treated him, too gently, as if one wrong touch might cause him to break. Yet outside his private rooms, the machinery of the Spanish court turned as relentlessly as ever. In the council chambers, ministers spoke of potential brides, princesses from Austria, Portugal, even France. They debated dowries, territories, and alliances. Not one of them mentioned the risk of asking a frail boy to sire an heir. The word infertility was never spoken aloud. For the ministers, marriage was a cure-all. For the physicians, it was a gamble. For Carlos, it was an abstract concept he barely understood, something distant and shadowed, like a story half heard through a wall. That summer, the gardens outside his window grew wild with heat. Bees swarmed the lavender, and fountains glittered in the sun. Carlos watched the boys racing again, their shouts rising in the warm air. One stumbled, fell, and sprang back up laughing. Carlos wondered what it might be like to fall like that, to feel the grass against his skin and the sun on his face, without pain following in the next breath. He looked down at the book in front of him, its pages swimming. The tutor's voice droned on, but the words seemed distant. All he could hear was the sound of running feet. The Alcazar itself seemed to conspire in keeping him contained. Its corridors were long and echoing, its staircases steep and twisting. The rooms smelled faintly of incense and old stone, a scent that clung to the draperies and tapestries. Even here, far from his sister's apartments, the faint perfume of lavender sometimes drifted in, a reminder of Margarita Teresa and of the strange, shared inheritance they carried. The palace was a gilded cage. For Carlos, its beauty only sharpened the bars. One evening, as the light turned gold and the bells of Madrid marked the hour, Carlos stood at his window again. He leaned against the cool stone, watching the sky darken. The gardens below were empty now, the laughter gone. In the stillness, he could almost imagine himself out there, his legs straight, his breath steady, his words clear. A prince, not just in title, but in body. But reality returned quickly, as it always did. His legs trembled, his breath caught. The book still lay unfinished on the table behind him. The court would not stop to mourn what he could not do. They would press forward, arranging alliances, planning weddings, rehearsing ceremonies. They would dress him in silk, place a crown on his head, and send him to stand beside a bride chosen not for love, but for blood. They would ignore the poison running through that blood, just as they ignored it in his sister. Because to admit it would be to dismantle the very foundation of their power. And in this world, power mattered more than health, more than truth. And so, while Carlos struggled to read the simplest words, the court prepared to write his future for him. A bride would be chosen, A wedding would be held, and the fragile boy who could not run would be thrust into the oldest and most dangerous of Habsburg traditions. A marriage meant to save the line, but destined to expose its fatal flaw. The bells of Madrid tolled like a slow heartbeat. 1, 2, 3. The sound rolled across rooftops, through narrow streets, into the open square where the Cathedral of Santa Maria la Real de la Almudena loomed, its stone facade glowing in the pale November light. It was November 1679, the day Spain had waited for, the day Europe had been watching. Inside the cathedral, incense curled upward toward the vaulted ceiling, blurring the golden light of tall wax candles. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of frankincense, beeswax, and damp stone. Every pew was filled. Nobles in silks and furs, foreign ambassadors with jeweled badges of office, churchmen in their crimson and white vestments. All eyes turned toward the central aisle. The music swelled. The king had arrived. Carlos II of Spain, 18 years old and already a king for nearly half his life, was a fragile shadow inside a robe of gold. The fabric seemed to swallow him, its weight dragging against his narrow shoulders. His face was pale, almost translucent in the candlelight. The infamous Habsburg jaw jutted forward, lips unable to close fully, his teeth misaligned. 2 attendants flanked him, steadying his slow steps toward the altar. With each movement, the golden robe whispered against the marble floor. The murmur in the pews was not admiration, but calculation, eyes measuring his gait, his breath, his strength, his worth. At the front of the cathedral, Maria Luisa of Orleans waited. 17, with dark hair coiled in French fashion, she stood in a gown of cream satin embroidered with silver thread. Her beauty was undeniable, but her eyes, for those close enough to see, held a trace of unease. She had been in Spain for only a week, plucked from the glittering court of her uncle, King Louis XIV, and deposited in a country where every gesture was wrapped in formality and every word was heavy with politics. Rumor whispered she had wept upon first meeting her husband-to-be. Those tears were gone now, replaced by a mask of composure. She curtsied when Carlos reached her side, her satin skirts pooling like pale water on the marble. The ceremony began. Cardinal Portocarrero's voice rose in solemn Latin, the echo lingering in the high arches. Gold-threaded banners hung from the pillars, bearing the crests of Spain and France intertwined, a visual promise of unity. But unity was not what the ambassadors saw. They saw an alliance born not of strength, but of desperation. When it came time for the vows, Carlos's voice trembled. The words were clear in the cardinal's mouth, but stumbled in the king's, his tongue too large, his jaw aching with the effort. His pitch was higher than expected, the sound more boy than man. The congregation held its breath. Maria Luisa glanced toward him, her expression unreadable. She spoke her vows without hesitation, her voice strong, her French accent softened for Spanish ears. 2 attendants guided Carlos's hands as he placed the wedding ring on her finger. His fingers shook. For a moment, it seemed the simple gold band might slip from his grasp. But at last, it slid into place. From the pews, some looked on with genuine sympathy. Others, with the cold detachment of gamblers assessing their odds. Could this man produce an heir? Could this union breathe life into a dynasty on the verge of extinction? The choir sang, the bells outside rang again, and the congregation rose in a wave of silk and jewels. On the surface, it was a royal wedding like any other. Gilded, magnificent, steeped in ritual. But beneath the surface ran an undercurrent of dread. After the ceremony, the royal procession wound its way back to the Alcazar Palace. The streets were lined with citizens, cheering and waving banners, though even among them the murmurs could not be fully suppressed. The king looked thin, they said. Too thin. Inside the palace, the wedding feast was prepared in the great hall. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted pheasants, venison pies, bowls of sugared almonds, and platters of fresh oranges from Valencia. Goblets of red wine caught the flicker of torchlight. But at the head table, Carlos barely touched his food. Chewing was laborious. The misalignment of his jaw turned even tender meat into a trial. He sipped at broths, tasted small spoonfuls of soft puree, and smiled faintly when his bride spoke to him in careful Spanish. Around them, the music played, dancers spun, and toasts were raised. Yet from certain corners of the hall, the foreign envoys watched with predators' patience. They saw not a marriage, but an empire's last throw of the dice. In a quieter corner, two older nobles spoke in low voices. "Look at him," one murmured, "like a candle burning at both ends." "And she?" the other asked. "A blossom cut too soon," came the reply, "but perhaps still capable of seed, if the gardener has the strength." They fell silent as the Queen Mother passed by, her gaze sharp as a blade. Mariana of Austria was not a woman to tolerate loose tongues, and both men knew it. As evening deepened, the rituals moved toward their inevitable climax. The nuptial chamber awaited. It was a chamber prepared not for romance, but for duty. The bed was draped in heavy brocade, the sheets perfumed with orange blossom. Candles flickered in every corner, casting a golden glow across the walls. In another room, monks prayed for the success of the night, their voices a low hum like distant bees. Carlos was helped from his wedding robe, his body revealed to be shockingly thin beneath the layers. He drank a small cup of dark liquid, a tonic laced with cinnamon, cloves, and a whispered promise of virility. Maria Luisa, in her own antechamber, was undressed and bathed in warm water, scented with rose petals. Her ladies murmured encouragements, combing her hair until it shone. She listened in silence. The expectations were unspoken but absolute. The consummation of the marriage was not a private act in the royal world. It was the first and most vital test of the union. In some courts, the proof was paraded before witnesses. In Spain, discretion was kept, but everyone would know soon enough if the ritual had been fulfilled. Maria Luisa entered the chamber first. Carlos followed, his steps slow but steady. The door closed. The guards took their positions outside. Inside, the candles burned low. History would not record what passed between them that night in detail, only that the morning brought no public declaration of success, no jubilant whispers from the Queen's ladies, no sly smiles from the King's attendants. The sheets were not displayed. The courtiers avoided the subject, and the foreign ambassadors made their own conclusions. The silence was louder than any announcement. As the days turned to weeks, the pattern held. Carlos attended to his royal duties in the council chamber. Maria Luisa appeared beside him at formal events, and the court maintained the outward appearance of stability. But behind the scenes, the pressure began to mount. Physicians brought new tonics, more exotic with each passing month. Alchemists promised elixirs drawn from rare stones. Priests blessed the royal bed. None of it changed the truth that was beginning to calcify in the minds of the courtiers. The king could not perform the one act upon which the future of Spain depended. And yet, the public charade continued. Gilded ceilings, perfumed halls, endless feasts. The trappings of a court determined to convince itself that appearances were enough, but in the quiet spaces, away from music and ceremony, Maria Luisa's eyes betrayed the truth. Hope was slipping away, one candle's length at a time. And while the wedding splendor faded into the routines of court life, a heavier ritual loomed. The night after night repetition of an act the king could not complete, and the unspoken realization that this marriage, like the dynasty itself, was already standing on the edge of collapse. The nuptial chamber glowed like a reliquary. Dozens of candles crowded the silver candelabra, their flames bending in the warm drafts that slipped beneath the heavy velvet drapes. Shadows moved across the brocade walls like silent spectators. The air was thick, too thick, with incense, ambergris, and the sharp sweetness of crushed rose petals scattered across the embroidered sheets. This was not a room prepared for love. It was prepared for history. In a chapel nearby, monks knelt on cold flagstones, their voices murmuring through the thin walls. They prayed in Latin for strength, for fertility, for the consummation that would anchor Spain's future to this very night. The deep hum of their chant mixed with the slow hiss of candle wicks burning. In the Queen's antechamber, Maria Luisa of Orleans stood still as her ladies made their final adjustments. Satin fell from her shoulders like cream spilling from a cup. Her hair was loosened, dark waves cascading down her back. The scent of orange blossom oil rose from her skin. The women around her spoke in low voices, offering last-minute advice, as though preparing a soldier for battle. "Remember, Your Majesty," murmured the Duchess of Terranova, her chief lady-in-waiting. "The realm depends on this night." Maria Luisa smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed something closer to resignation than to hope. In France, she had been taught the duties of a royal bride. In Spain, she would learn their consequences. In the adjoining room, Carlos II was being prepared with equal ceremony. Attendants unfastened the stiff brocade of his wedding attire, revealing a body that seemed almost too fragile to carry the weight of a crown. His ribs rose sharply with each breath. His arms were thin, the skin pale as wax. One servant approached with a small cup. Inside, a dark liquid shimmered in the candlelight, a concoction of cinnamon, saffron, powdered pearls, and a pinch of something rarer still. It was said to stir desire, to spark vitality where none lived. The king's thin hands shook as he lifted it to his lips. The taste was bitter beneath the spice. He swallowed without a word. The air in the bedchamber seemed to tighten as the appointed hour approached. The ladies withdrew, the attendants retreated, and the guards took their posts. Outside the heavy door, inside, the two young monarchs faced each other, alone except for the relentless glow of the candles and the whisper of silk against the floor. Maria Luisa moved first, crossing to the bed. She sat at its edge, her fingers lightly brushing the embroidered coverlet. Carlos stood for a moment longer, as though considering the distance between them was greater than the length of the room. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he joined her. What passed in the next hour, or hours, was never spoken aloud. The court would not permit such scandalous detail to cross lips or parchment, but the absence of what followed spoke volumes. No jubilant whispers from the Queen's ladies, no subtle nods from the King's attendants, no discreet inspection of the bed linen carried out at dawn. Instead, there was silence. By morning, that silence had seeped beyond the bedchamber, down the corridors, into the kitchens and courtyards. It slid into conversations like cold air under a door. The question hung unasked, but understood. Had the marriage been truly sealed? The answer was in the eyes of those closest to the royal couple. In the measured way the Queen Mother avoided the subject, in the careful choice of words when ministers spoke of the wedding. Spain's greatest secret was that its king might never be able to fulfill the most basic expectation of a monarch, to father an heir. The court chose not to confront the truth outright. To do so would have been to admit that the empire's fate now dangled over an abyss. Instead, they built a wall of ritual and denial. Every evening, the nuptial chamber was prepared again. Sheets freshened, perfumes renewed, candles lit anew. Each night, the couple retired behind the heavy door, and each morning they emerged to face the pageantry of court life without a child conceived. Every repetition was a quiet tightening of the noose around the Habsburg dynasty's neck. In another wing of the palace, Princess Margarita Teresa felt the echo of that tightening, though her own fate was already sealed. Her health had begun to fail with increasing speed. Fainting fits stole hours from her days. Her once bright eyes dulled, her step slowed. She knew nothing of the details of her brother's nights, but she understood the weight of their shared inheritance. The poison in their bloodline, once an abstraction, was becoming visible in both of them. Weeks passed, then months. Physicians brought new tonics to the king. Bitter draughts infused with exotic herbs from the New World, syrups laced with ground ivory, even tiny pellets of powdered gold. Alchemists whispered of rarer substances, some so costly they could bankrupt a noble family for a year. None of it worked. Carlos grew thinner still. His breath came with more effort. His eyes seemed to recede into his face. The queen's smile, once radiant, became a mask she could put on and remove at will. The ambassadors noticed. In their letters to their home courts, they wrote with careful precision, "The union is cordial, but there is no sign of the expected issue." Between the lines, their monarchs could read the truth. For Spain's rivals, it was an opportunity. For Spain's allies, a cause for unease. For the Habsburgs, it was a slow, unending humiliation. And so, the palace continued its strange dance, the daily theater of a marriage that could not fulfill its purpose. The great halls were lit for feasts. Musicians played, courtiers danced, and the couple appeared at the head of the room, hands lightly touching. But beneath the gold leaf and silk, there was the ever-present knowledge that nothing had changed. The empire waited for a cry that would never come. The cry of a newborn to prove the line still lived. And while the court clung to its nightly rituals, hoping for a miracle, fate was already moving in another direction. In the other wing of the Alcazar, Margarita's decline deepened, her body following the same quiet descent as her brother's. The rot in the bloodline was no longer something to be whispered about. It was beginning to show in every breath, every step, every day that passed without an heir. The first fainting spell came without warning. Princess Margarita Teresa had been standing in the audience chamber, a string of pearls cool against her neck when the walls seemed to bend inward. The rustle of silks and the murmur of courtiers' voices became a low, muffled hum, as if she were sinking underwater. Her fingers reached for the carved armrest of a nearby chair and missed. The marble floor rose to meet her. Gasps rippled through the hall. A lady-in-waiting rushed forward, skirts whispering, and cradled the princess's head. Someone shouted for the physician. Someone else drew the curtains, as though softening the light might soften the truth. When Margarita opened her eyes again, the faces above her were pale with alarm, and the smell of rosewater filled her nostrils. Sharp, almost medicinal. In the weeks that followed, the fainting became more frequent. Sometimes she would sway during an audience with visiting dignitaries, forcing her ladies to steady her discreetly. Other times, she would simply not rise from her bed, her body leaden with exhaustion she could not explain. Her skin, once compared to porcelain, grew nearly translucent, veins tracing delicate blue lines beneath its surface. Her eyes seemed to sink deeper into her face, their brightness fading. Even her hair, once thick and lustrous, began to lose its weight, strands coming loose into the comb each morning. The palace physicians prescribed everything they could think of, and some things they could barely defend. First came the milk baths, steaming basins of goat's milk into which she was lowered, with care. The scent was cloying, almost sour beneath the perfume of jasmine sprinkled over the surface. She sat there until her skin puckered, the milk cooling against her flesh, as the physicians murmured that this would restore vitality. Then came the compresses, poultices of crushed rosemary, thyme, and lemon peel, wrapped in linen and pressed to her temples or laid across her chest. These were meant to balance the humors, though the only noticeable effect was the lingering bitter aroma that followed her through the corridors. Amulets were sewn into the hems of her gowns, small pouches of blessed salt, tiny silver crosses, even a sliver of bone said to be from a saint's finger. They bumped lightly against her knees as she walked, a silent reminder that her survival had become an act of superstition as much as medicine. None of it worked. The mirror in her bedchamber became an enemy. It stood in the corner, framed in dark wood, its glass polished to a clarity that showed every line, every shadow. Margarita began to avoid it, turning her head as her ladies dressed her, keeping her eyes fixed on the wall or the floor. She knew what she would see if she looked too closely. The heavy Habsburg jaw, inherited like a family crest, the pale lips drawn too tightly over her teeth, the hollows beneath her eyes where health had once lived. It was not simply vanity, it was recognition that her body was a map of her bloodline's decline. Yet in her weakness, she began to see more clearly the world around her. She noticed the way the servants' eyes lingered on her when they thought she wasn't looking. Pity swimming in the depths. She noticed the calculating glances of foreign ambassadors, measuring her health the way merchants measured goods. She noticed the way conversation shifted when she entered a room, as if her presence were a reminder of something everyone wished to forget. Most of all, she noticed her father's cough. King Philip IV's deep, rattling cough echoed through the halls, reverberating off the marble and tapestry. Once, it had been a rare interruption to the rhythm of court life. Now it came often, sometimes doubling him over mid-sentence. She began to wonder if they were both descending the same staircase, step by step, toward an ending neither could avoid. The Alcazar itself seemed to grow heavier as the days shortened. Its stone walls, built for defense and grandeur, now felt like the sides of a tomb slowly sealing. Light struggled to reach the deeper corridors. The air was always scented: lavender water in the guest rooms, cinnamon oil in the private chapels, rose water in the queen's apartments. But beneath it all was something fainter, older. The smell of roses left too long in their vases, petals curling inward, stems slick with decay. Margarita could not escape it. It seemed to follow her, clinging to the folds of her gown, winding its way into her hair. It was the scent of beauty, dying in slow motion. Her audiences grew shorter. Ambassadors were received in rooms where she could sit, the strain of standing now too great. She spoke less, choosing her words carefully, her breath often shallow. The courtiers still bowed, still addressed her with every title, but the formality could not disguise the truth. She was fading. Letters from Vienna arrived with increasing frequency, inquiries from her Habsburg kin about her health. They were couched in polite language, but she knew their purpose: to assess her worth as a dynastic pawn. Even now, even with her body failing, her value was measured in the potential of marriage alliances she would never live to see fulfilled. At night, she dreamed of the gardens she had once walked as a child, before the fainting, before the heaviness in her limbs. In those dreams, the air was fresh, the flowers alive, the fountains bright with water. She would wake to find herself in the same bedchamber, the same scented air pressing against her skin, the same walls closing in. Sometimes she wondered which would come first: her brother's failure to produce an heir, or her own absence from the court entirely. There were moments of clarity in the fog of her illness, moments when she could stand at her window and see the sun fall in sheets across the rooftops of Madrid, the city sprawling outward toward the hills. In those moments, she could almost believe that life beyond the palace existed, that the world did not revolve solely around the fragile bodies of a dying dynasty. But the coughing in the hall would return, or the faint dizziness would begin to pull at her vision, and the truth would settle back into place, like dust on untouched furniture. The courtiers were careful not to speak of her condition in public, but the silence only made it louder. She could feel the question hovering over her, just as it hovered over her brother: how long? And though she would never voice it, she carried her own question in the quiet hours. Why? Why had their family clung so tightly to its own blood that it had poisoned itself? Why had they confused pride with preservation, tradition with survival? Each day without an heir from Carlos was another turn of the key in the lock sealing their dynasty's fate. Margarita knew she would not live to see the door fully closed, but she could feel it even now, pressing shut from the other side. And as Margarita's steps grew slower, the palace turned its gaze back to the root of the sickness. The physicians had begun to whisper again about blood purity, the blessing and the curse that bound the Habsburgs to their throne and to their doom. The price was no longer hidden in the blood. It was written plainly in the bodies of the last of their line. The royal physician worked alone. The rest of the palace had long gone quiet, its echoes swallowed by night. The corridors of the Alcazar lay in darkness, but in a small chamber off the library, a single candle burned, its thin flame trembling in the draught from the high arched window. The physician, a man whose hands had tended to 3 generations of Spain's royals, sat hunched over a thick, leather-bound volume. The cover was cracked, the edges worn soft by decades of handling. Across its front, in faded Latin script, was the title, Morbis Hereditarius, on hereditary diseases. Its author, Dr. Luis Mercado, had been a royal doctor himself in an earlier century. His words, written in a careful, slanted hand, were as sharp as they were dangerous. The repeated union of blood too close in kin produces fragile offspring, prone to sickness, deformity, and in the worst cases, incapable of reproduction. The physician traced the words with his finger, as though they might disappear if he did not commit them to memory. In truth, they already had disappeared, at least from the minds of those who most needed to remember them. In the Habsburg world, purity was not simply a point of pride, it was the cornerstone of power. A pure bloodline, they believed, was proof of divine favor. To dilute it by marrying outside the tightly bound circle of royal kin was to invite weakness, disloyalty, and the possibility that the crown might slip from Habsburg hands. The solution, repeated for centuries, was as simple as it was lethal. Marry within, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, aunt to nephew. The practice had once been politically brilliant, a way to weld kingdoms together in bonds that could not be broken by treaties alone. But time is a harsher ruler than any monarch, and nature does not obey the rules of dynasties. The physician closed the manuscript and sat back. He thought of his patients. Princess Margarita Teresa, daughter of an uncle and niece. King Carlos II, son of the same pairing. It was as if the family tree had folded in on itself, the same names appearing on both sides of the parchment, branches circling back until they no longer reached toward the sun. Each generation condensed the flaws of the one before, like a lens focusing sunlight until the object beneath it began to burn. The results were no longer hidden. They walked the corridors of the Alcazar, pale and bent, their health too fragile to carry the weight of the crown they were born to wear. But the truth could not be spoken aloud. To question the bloodline was treason. To suggest that God's chosen family might be destroying itself was heresy. The court spoke instead of God's will, of mysterious ailments, of nervous constitutions, and delicate humors. They avoided words like inbreeding and degeneration, as if avoiding them would keep the curse at bay. In the eyes of the clergy, the dynasty's purity was sacred. In the minds of the 80 ministers, it was strategic. In the hearts of the people, it was unquestionable, because questioning it meant questioning the very order of the world. The physician returned to the candlelit pages. The ink had faded, but the warning was clear. Mercado had not couched his language in flattery. He had seen the danger even in his time, when the signs were smaller. A child who failed to thrive, a prince prone to fever, a princess whose beauty masked brittle bones. But his cautions had been politely ignored. The marriages had continued. He thought of other dynasties too. The Ptolemies of Egypt, who had married brother to sister until madness and deformity were commonplace. The ancient pharaohs, who had convinced their people that godhood could be passed down like property, even as their heirs faltered. Nature had resisted them too. And now it resisted the Habsburgs. In the corridors above, life at court continued as if nothing were amiss. Margarita, pale and drawn, moved through her rooms like a shadow. Carlos sat in council meetings, his head nodding under the weight of the crown, his attendants ready to catch him should he falter. The Queen Mother still held her receptions, still spoke proudly of the family's history, still defended the sanctity of their marriages. But the physician could see what they could not, or would not. He saw it in the swelling at Carlos's jaw, the tremor in his hands, the slow drag of his right leg. He saw it in Margarita's fainting spells, the bluish tint to her lips, the thinness of her hair. They were not cursed by God. They were cursed by their ancestors' decisions. The paradox was almost beautiful in its cruelty. The very practice that had once secured the Habsburg throne across Europe, from Madrid to Vienna to Prague, was now dismantling it from within. Purity had been their fortress. Now it was their prison. And unlike political enemies, nature could not be bargained with, bribed, or threatened. The physician dipped his quill in ink and began to copy Mercado's words onto a fresh sheet of parchment. He wrote carefully, aware that the act itself might be dangerous if discovered. He was not copying them for the court. They would not listen. He was copying them for himself, so that he would not forget what history had already tried to teach. Every page was a silent indictment. Every sentence a reminder that this outcome had been predicted and preventable. Down the hall, a clock chimed softly. The physician closed the book, extinguished the candle, and stepped into the dark corridor. The air smelled faintly of roses and dust, the same scent that seemed to cling to every corner of the Alcazar. It was the smell of beauty at the edge of decay, of something once glorious now beginning to collapse. He wondered how many more years it would take before the collapse was complete. He, Duwam, suspected not many. Outside, the night pressed close around the palace. Beyond Madrid's rooftops, the fields stretched into darkness, their stillness a stark contrast to the flickering instability within the royal walls. The physician did not pray for the Habsburgs that night. He had seen enough to know that prayers could not undo what blood had already written. And as the physician's footsteps faded into the dark, the court above him carried on with its rituals, arranging alliances, entertaining ambassadors, planning marriages. All the while, Europe watched and waited, sensing the fragility of Spain's crown. For outside the Alcazar, the wolves had begun to circle. The years slid by like candle wax, slow, but with a weight that could not be reversed. It had been 3 years since the wedding of Carlos II and Maria Luisa of Orleans, and still the royal nursery stood empty. The cradle, crafted from walnut and inlaid with ivory, sat in a darkened corner, draped in cloth to protect it from dust. No infant had ever touched it. No lullaby had ever been sung there. At first, the court whispered of patience. Nature, they said, worked in its own time, but patience soured into murmurs, and murmurs into certainty. The king was incapable. Maria Luisa bore the rumors with the composure of someone who had been raised in a court where gossip was as constant as breathing. But composure could not mask the toll. Her cheeks lost their flush, her smiles grew fixed, and her eyes, once bright with French wit, began to dim. Her ladies saw it most clearly. The way her hands lingered on the cradle's draped edge during visits to the storage room. The quiet moments when she pressed a palm to her stomach, as though willing life to take root. She knew the truth as well as anyone. It was not her body that had failed. Beyond the palace walls, the truth traveled faster than any carriage. Diplomats from Vienna, London, and Paris sent their reports home, lines inked with careful understatement, but carrying a single, unmistakable message. The King of Spain will leave no heir. In Paris, Louis XIV read the dispatches with a thin smile. In Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs, cousins to Carlos, grew restless. In London and The Hague, ministers began speaking in hushed tones about the division of the Spanish Empire when the inevitable came. The vultures were not circling anymore. They were choosing their landing spots. Within Spain, the tension was palpable, the kind of pressure that fills the air before a summer storm breaks. Taxes climbed higher to feed a treasury drained by decades of war and court excess. The armies dwindled, their armor dented, and their horses thin. In the taverns, men hunched over mugs of bitter wine, muttering about omens and curses. Some blamed the French queen for bringing bad fortune. Others spoke of God's judgment, punishing Spain for its pride. A few whispered the more dangerous truth, that the royal blood itself was poisoned. It was a truth that never dared cross the palace gates, but it did not need to. It lived in every unlit cradle, in every uncelebrated birth. And yet, inside the Alcazar, the ritual of hope persisted. Feasts were held for the court and foreign envoys. Toasts were raised to the future Prince of Asturias, a child who, year after year, failed to materialize. Priests blessed the royal bedchamber, sprinkling holy water across the embroidered pillows. Physicians offered new remedies, each one touted as the miracle that would succeed where the last had failed. Carlos drank the tonics without protest, his expression unreadable. Maria Luisa smiled through the banquets, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The charade was seamless, but the silence between them was the truest part of their marriage. From her own chambers, Margarita Teresa watched this theater with the clarity of one who no longer had the strength to participate. Her health had withered further. The fainting spells came more often. Her hands trembled when she tried to write. She no longer attended public audiences, claiming exhaustion. The truth was simpler. She had nothing left to offer the court's pageantry. But she saw what the others refused to say aloud. She saw it in the way the candles in the great hall burned low before the feasts were over, in the way ministers' voices grew quieter when the conversation turned to the succession. She saw it in her brother's eyes, which had taken on the same distant, unfocused look as their father's in his final years. She knew the candle of their dynasty was burning at both ends. On one side, Carlos, the monarch in name but not in strength, unable to secure the future with an heir. On the other, herself, the last sister of the line, too ill to stand without aid, her body a living testament to the price they had paid for their so-called purity. Between them lay an empire that stretched across continents, its fate now balanced on nothing more substantial than hope and pretense. In the council chambers, the ministers avoided open panic, but their strategies began to shift. The old certainty that a Habsburg would always sit on the Spanish throne had begun to erode. Discussions of trade treaties and military campaigns were now laced with careful references to contingencies. Foreign ambassadors noticed. They saw the way Spanish officials hesitated before answering questions about the succession, the way their hands tightened around their wine cups during diplomatic banquets, and every hesitation was reported back home. The people too could feel the uncertainty. In the markets, traders raised their prices before the French come. In the countryside, farmers spoke of storing grain in case war swept through the fields. Even the clergy began weaving warnings into their sermons that God would not preserve Spain forever if it did not act wisely. Still in the palace, the music played. The feasts continued. The Queen Mother still hosted her receptions, her voice steady as she repeated the same reassurances she had given for years. But outside, the air smelled like rain before lightning. One night, as autumn winds rattled the palace shutters, Margarita sat by her window, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Below, the courtyard torches burned in neat lines, their flames flickering in the gusts. She thought of her childhood, when the palace had seemed unshakable, its walls like the bones of a giant that would stand forever. Now she felt the tremors, not in the stone itself, but in the people who walked its halls. Dynasties, she knew, did not fall in a single day. They unraveled slowly, thread by thread, until one morning, the tapestry lay in pieces on the floor, and she could feel the threads slipping through their fingers already. As winter closed in, a shadow fell across the court. The Queen's smiles grew rarer, the King's steps slower. And then came the news that would darken the Alcazar even further. The sudden death of Maria Luisa of Orleans, a blow not just to the King's heart, but to the last, fragile hope for the Habsburg succession. The bells of Madrid tolled again, but this time there was no celebration in their sound. It was the spring of 1689, and the air over the city was heavy, not with the heat of summer, but with the stillness that follows a sudden loss. Maria Luisa of Orleans, Queen of Spain, was dead. She was only 26. The official account was swift and neat. A ruptured appendix, the surgeons said. Death from internal infection. But whispers slipped through the court like smoke. Some said she had been poisoned. Others, quieter still, murmured that she had simply lost the will to live. In her final months, she had grown frail, her smiles more brittle, her laughter rare. She had lived for a decade in a marriage where the cradle stayed empty, where every public appearance was shadowed by the unspoken question of an heir who never came. For a queen of Spain, that question was a blade pressed constantly against the throat. Carlos was shattered. He had never been a man of great emotional range. His life had been dominated by duty, illness, and the heavy machinery of court politics. But Maria Luisa had been his companion through those years of quiet humiliation. She had played her part without cruelty, had shared in the silence that followed their wedding night, and had stood beside him through the rituals of hope that both of them knew were hopeless. When she died, something in Carlos seemed to fold inward. For days, the Alcazar was draped in black. The courtiers moved softly, their voices hushed, their steps muffled against the thick rugs. In the Queen's apartments, her gowns still hung in the wardrobes, the faint scent of her perfume lingering on their folds. But grief could not be allowed to stall the machinery of the monarchy. Spain still had no heir, and the dynasty's candle burned lower with every year. The council convened within weeks of the Queen's burial. A new wife must be found. The search was deliberate and coldly pragmatic. The candidate must be young, politically advantageous. But above all, she must come from a proven bloodline. Not just noble blood, but fertile blood. The chosen bride was Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess of the Palatinate, daughter of Philip William, Elector Palatine. Her mother had borne 23 children, a number so vast it was recited at court like a prayer. Here, they said, was nature's guarantee. Here was a womb that could save Spain. The desperation was grotesque in its transparency. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. It did not matter if Carlos loved her, if she loved him, or even if she understood the weight she was walking into. All that mattered was that her body might accomplish what Maria Luisa's had not. The marriage was agreed, the diplomatic papers signed, and Mariana was brought to Spain with the full pomp due to a queen. She arrived in 1690, 17 years old, fresh-faced, and full of the confidence of one who has been told her greatest gift is her ability to produce life. The wedding was held with the same gilded ritual as the first. The bells rang, the cathedral filled, the feasts overflowed with meats and wine. Courtiers smiled, foreign envoys bowed, and beneath it all, the same silent wager was placed again, that this night, unlike the last, would end with the making of an heir. It did not. The pattern repeated exactly as before. The nuptial chamber prepared with rose petals and incense, the potions laced with spices and supposed aphrodisiacs, the long nights followed by silent mornings. No child came. Mariana at first remained hopeful. She followed the physician's instructions, drank the tonics, prayed in the royal chapel for fertility. But as months became years, her expressions hardened. Her letters to her family in Germany began to hint at frustration and, eventually, contempt. For Carlos, the strain deepened his physical decline. He grew thinner still, his shoulders stooped, his step unsteady. His skin took on a waxen pallor. His breath grew short. The list of his ailments expanded. Chronic digestive troubles, fevers, trembling hands, and fits of exhaustion that left him bedridden for days. The court could not hide it. Whispers swelled in the corridors. The king is dying. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in plain language now. No heir, no strength. The end is inevitable. In Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs began positioning themselves for a claim to the Spanish throne. In France, Louis XIV's ministers worked quietly, laying the groundwork for a Bourbon inheritance. In London and The Hague, English and Dutch envoys began calculating the balance of power in a Europe without a strong Spain. Far from Madrid, in Vienna, Margarita Teresa lived out her own decline. She had been married off years earlier to her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. another Habsburg marriage designed to keep the bloodline pure. But her body, like her brother's, was already weakened by their shared inheritance. In Vienna, she bore children, but few survived infancy. She herself aged rapidly, her health deteriorating with each passing year. By the time Carlos was failing in Madrid, Margarita was gone, dead at just 21. Her death was recorded with ceremony, but in truth, it was only another step in the long, quiet collapse of their dynasty. Back in Spain, Carlos faced the reality that his reign would end without a child to succeed him. It was a truth he could not escape. He saw it in the faces of his ministers, who avoided his eyes. He heard it in the careful way courtiers spoke around him, never mentioning the future without hesitation. The palace was heavy with waiting, the waiting of a court that knew the end was near, the waiting of foreign powers, already preparing to divide Spain's empire like vultures over a carcass, the waiting of a man who knew that his body, fragile, malformed, cursed by history, was the final link in a chain that had been tightening for centuries. The irony was cruel. The Habsburg obsession with preserving their bloodline had begun as a way to hold power, to keep crowns and territories within the family. It had worked for a time, but every generation had paid a greater price, and Carlos would pay the last. His life was the sum of their decisions. His death would be their legacy. And as the 1690s drew toward their close, the signs could no longer be disguised. The king could scarcely walk unaided. His speech was slurred, his mind often clouded. And in the royal gardens, a man tending to the plants began to notice a strange truth, that nature itself seemed to resist what the Habsburgs had tried to force. The royal gardens of El Buen Retiro were quiet in the early morning. The mists still clung to the hedges, curling low around the stone fountains, and the air smelled of damp earth and cut grass. Here, far from the echoing corridors of the Alcazar, the business of life and death was carried out in silence. A man bent over a row of flowering shrubs, his fingers brushing the leaves with the tenderness of a physician examining a patient. He was José Carey Martínez, the king's botanist, a man who had spent decades cataloging the flora of Spain's estates. Today, his face was drawn, his eyes narrowed. The leaves before him were pale, almost translucent. The stems were thin and brittle, snapping easily under the weight of their own flowers. It was not drought, nor poor soil. He knew the cause. Too much crossbreeding, too many years of taking from the same root. He straightened slowly, wiping the dirt from his hands, and looked toward the high palace walls in the distance. He did not say it aloud. No one in his position would dare. But the thought came unbidden, heavy as the morning fog. It is the same with them as it is with these plants. When blood or sap circles back on itself too often, it does not strengthen, it weakens. The defects compound, the resilience fades, and one day, the stem can no longer hold the bloom. Inside the palace, the metaphor had already taken human form. Carlos II could no longer walk unaided for any distance. Ministers would see him arrive in the council chamber, leaning on the arm of an attendant, his steps slow and uncertain. Once seated, he rarely moved except to shift painfully in his chair. His skin had taken on a waxen pallor, almost yellow in certain light, and his lips were tinged faintly blue on cold mornings. His breath wheezed audibly during long audiences. Courtiers who stood too close could see the slight tremor in his hands as he tried to hold documents or lift a goblet. The ministers noticed, and with the king's body weakening, his grip on power weakened too. Decisions were delayed, decrees signed only after long hesitation. This created a space into which others began to move. Advisors, cousins, ambitious nobles who had long waited for their moment. Political games grew bolder. Favors were traded in shadowed rooms. Alliances shifted like sand beneath the tide. Each maneuver was done in whispers, but the sound of those whispers was becoming constant, and through the cracks of Spain's courtly order, others slipped in. Foreign spies, some posing as merchants, some as clerks, some as musicians for the court, drifted into Madrid. They moved through the city's taverns and gardens, gathering scraps of information. Which ministers were arguing? Which generals were restless? Which treaties were vulnerable? But more than anything, they wanted details about the king's health, not the official accounts, but the truth. The way he struggled to rise from a chair, the fact that he could not ride for more than an hour without collapsing into exhaustion, the color of his skin when the fever took him. In the courts of Europe, such intelligence was worth more than gold. And yet, all the political intrigue, all the careful diplomacy, all the secret correspondence, none of it addressed the greatest and most dangerous truth. It was not political, it was biological. The root of the Spanish monarchy's crisis was not in the council chamber or on the battlefield, but in the marrow of its last king. The same forces that weakened José Care's garden. Repetition, enclosure, self-containment had been at work for generations in the Habsburg line. A tree that never spreads its branches wide will eventually collapse under its own weight. Carlos knew, at least in part, what was happening to him. In the rare moments when he was alone, he would run his hands over his legs and feel the wasted muscle. He would look at his reflection in a polished silver plate and see the hollowing of his cheeks, the way his skin clung too tightly to the sharp bones of his face. He could hear his own breath rasping at night. Even in sleep, there were mornings when he could not summon the strength to rise without help. His attendants learned to move silently, so that the sound of their footsteps would not make him feel watched in his weakness. The court pretended otherwise, of course. In the great hall, the king still appeared for feasts, seated in his high-backed chair, dressed in the finest silks, jewels glinting under the candlelight. Ministers toasted him. Foreign ambassadors bowed low. But everyone saw the tremor in his hands when he lifted his goblet. Everyone noticed that he no longer stood to greet guests. Every gesture of ceremony had become a kind of theater, designed to project stability, even as the truth eroded beneath it. The irony was almost cruel in its elegance. For decades, Spain had been willing to let its colonies bleed to keep the court in gold. It had been willing to send armies across Europe to defend the Habsburg claim to distant thrones. But the one battle it could not win was happening inside the body of its own king. And no treaty, no marriage, no war could change what centuries of inbreeding had written into his bones. In the gardens, José Care continued his work, quietly removing the weakest plants and replacing them with new seedlings, ones brought from other provinces with different roots, different strengths. He did it without ceremony, without proclamation. He sometimes wondered if the same could be done for dynasties. But unlike plants, kings could not be quietly uprooted and replaced without the soil itself, the empire being torn apart. So, he said nothing. The winter of 1696 was particularly harsh. The winds off the Sierra de Guadarrama howled through Madrid's narrow streets, rattling shutters and sending sparks skittering across the palace's great hearths. Carlos spent much of the season in bed, his body unable to hold warmth for long. When he did appear in public, he was swaddled in layers of velvet and fur, his face pale against the dark fabric. His breath was visible in the cold air, each exhale a ghost that vanished before it could speak. The ministers looked at him and saw not a ruler, but a clock winding down. And as winter yielded to spring, the palace clung to its rituals, the banquets, the ceremonies, the endless prayers. But in the shadowed corners of the Alcazar, the conversation had changed. No one was asking if the king could be saved. They were asking only how long he had left, and what would happen when the last Habsburg in Spain finally drew his last breath. The winter light in Madrid was thin, a pale, cold beam that filtered through the palace's high, frost-laced windows and seemed too weak to warm even the dust motes it illuminated. Within the Alcazar, fires roared in massive hearths, but the heat never reached the heart of the building. The air was heavy, slow-moving, clotted with the smell of incense and damp stone. And in a chamber deep inside, the last king of Spain's Habsburg line lay beneath a canopy of dark velvet, his body wrapped in layers of fur that could no longer keep out the chill. Carlos II had become more shadow than man. His eyes, once quick to dart nervously at every movement in the court, now stared blankly, the lids half lowered, as though even blinking took too much energy. His hair, once thick and black, was streaked with dull gray and fell lifelessly over his shoulders. The waxen pallor from the previous winter had worsened, as though the blood beneath his skin had thinned almost to nothing. Each breath was an effort, a drawn-out wheeze followed by a faint rattle. His attendants moved silently, not only out of respect, but because every sudden sound seemed to jar him, pulling him from some half-dream where his mind lingered. The court clung to ritual, as though ceremony could hold back decay. Holy relics were pressed to his chest, fragments of the true cross, bones of saints, pieces of cloth said to have wiped Christ's brow. Priests muttered prayers in Latin, their voices low and rhythmic, like a tide that never reached the shore. At night, candlelight flickered across the crucifixes hung on every wall, their shadows stretching over the bed like skeletal hands. But faith was not enough. Not for this. In desperation, the council sanctioned measures that teetered between medicine and superstition. One night, the king's attendants filled a copper tub with animal blood, still warm from the slaughter. The steam curled upward, carrying a sharp, metallic tang that mixed with the scent of burning frankincense. They lifted Carlos carefully into the bath, murmuring that the life of the animal would flow into his own. The water turned sluggish and dark around his thin frame. His lips trembled, but whether from cold, fear, or simple exhaustion, none could say. Another time, they performed an exorcism. The chamber was lit only by candles, their flames bowing in the draught as the priest circled the bed, chanting the ancient rites. Carlos's eyes followed him, not with fear, but with something worse, resignation, as though he had accepted that whatever spirit was to be driven out was not a demon at all, but himself. The physicians documented everything, their quills scratching across parchment. Pulse, weak and irregular. Temperature, low despite layers of fur. Skin, pale, waxen, with a faint odor of rot at the extremities. They trembled as they wrote, not from the cold, but from the weight of helplessness. Their books were full of cures for known ailments, yet nothing in their training, nothing in their ancestors' training, could halt the slow unraveling of a body poisoned by its own bloodline. They did not write that last part, of course. Not in ink. Outside the palace, Madrid whispered of omens. A winter eclipse turned the moon the color of rust. A comet blazed briefly in the night sky before vanishing into the darkness. Healthy children in the city sickened suddenly and died within hours, their parents speaking of curses. Some said the heavens themselves were signaling the end of the Habsburg line. Others said God had turned his face from Spain. In the taverns, the talk was not of if the king would die, but when, and what would follow. Inside, the air thickened. Incense burned constantly, but it could not mask the faint metallic scent that clung to the bedchamber. The smell of blood thinning, of a body's edges beginning to blur. The servants noticed it first, in the way the linens held a strange odor even when freshly changed. The king's meals grew smaller until even a spoonful of broth seemed to exhaust him. He would take it slowly, lips barely parting, his enlarged tongue moving awkwardly against the roof of his mouth. Sometimes he simply let the spoon rest, untouched, in its dish. Margarita was gone. Her death years earlier in Vienna had been marked by quiet mourning at court, a single black ribbon tied around the palace's great bell. Carlos had not attended any memorial, too weak to travel, too fragile to risk the journey, but he had asked once, in a voice like a whisper breaking in the wind, whether her grave was near flowers. The truth was that their lives had mirrored one another, a slow collapse under the weight of inheritance, an existence measured not in triumphs, but in what their bodies could no longer do. Now only one remained, and even he seemed to drift more in memory than in the present. By February, the palace's mood shifted. The courtiers, still dressed in their finest silks, still spoke with the clipped formality of etiquette, but their eyes followed the king's every movement and every stillness with the attention of men watching a candle gutter. At night, some prayed, others schemed. The ministers met behind closed doors, their maps of Europe spread out like a patient's anatomy. They knew the political body of Spain was as sick as its king, and when the final breath came, the vultures would descend. Carlos himself seemed caught between worlds. Some days he recognized those around him, even managing a faint smile or a whispered word. Other days, his gaze wandered to the far corner of the room, as though seeing something no one else could. Once, he asked if the bells of Vienna could be heard from Madrid. Another time, he murmured to a page to tell my father it is too cold. The boy, unsure what to do, bowed and left in silence. On the coldest night of that winter, the wind rattled the shutters and the king's breathing faltered. His lips moved without sound, the words too faint to catch. An attendant leaned closer, and for a moment thought he heard him say, "Let it end." But the sound was swallowed by the crackle of the fire. The relics remained on his chest. The incense still burned. The candles still guttered in the draught. But nothing, not faith, not blood, not all the gold of Spain, could halt what had been set in motion long before he was born. And so, as winter dragged toward its close, the court waited, not for recovery, but for the moment history would change hands. The last Habsburg of Spain was slipping away, and with him, the world they had built on the brittle foundation of purity would crumble into the dust of the new century. The morning of November 1st, 1700, began with bells. They rolled over Madrid in heavy, uneven peals, not the triumphant clang of victory, but the slow, deliberate toll of finality. Each strike seemed to hang in the air, muffled by the damp autumn mist that clung to the city streets. Merchants paused mid-step, priests lowered their heads, and the common people crossed themselves, whispering the same name, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. In the darkened bedchamber of the Alcazar, the last king of Spain's Habsburg dynasty lay still beneath a canopy of black velvet. His lips were parted slightly, as they had been for much of his life, his jaw too misshapen to ever fully close. His skin, once pale, had taken on the gray-yellow hue of extinguished candle wax. The eyes, clouded and sunken, stared half open, fixed on some distant point no one in the room could see. Around him, the air was thick with the mingled scents of burnt incense, stale sweat, and the faint metallic tang of death. The courtiers stood in silence, their jeweled finery dull in the gloom, while priests murmured prayers for a soul already fled. Carlos II was dead, 39 years old, though his body had long carried the weight of centuries of decline. His death was not a surprise. For months, the palace had existed in a state of hushed anticipation, the machinery of state holding its breath. But the moment itself still struck like a stone breaking ice, the sound of something ancient finally giving way. There would be no heir, no son to carry the Habsburg name, no continuation of the line that had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries. The physicians, grim-faced, were called forward. The autopsy was not meant for public record. It was to be whispered about, guarded, a private dissection of a royal failure. In the cold light of the surgical room, they cut open the man who had been king and found a body as strange in death as it had been in life. No blood in the veins, only a thin, watery fluid. A heart the size of a peppercorn, shrunken and hard. Lungs mottled and decayed, like parchment left to rot in damp air. Gangrenous intestines, blackened and brittle to the touch. A single, shriveled testicle, the symbol of a dynasty's desperate hope, reduced to a useless fragment. And where the brain should have filled the skull, they found only fluid, sloshing faintly as the head was moved. To the physicians of 1700, it was a mystery. To the centuries that followed, the explanation would be clear. the inescapable mathematics of inbreeding. The Habsburgs had guarded their bloodline with a zeal they called purity, but purity had turned to poison, and poison had made its home in Carlos's body before he had even drawn his first breath. The bones were weak, the muscles wasted, the organs malformed. His entire life had been a slow, meticulous collapse. The whispers began almost immediately. Servants repeated what they had heard from the surgeons, exaggerating some details, inventing others. In the kitchens, they said the king's heart had been so small it could slip through a ring. In the stables, they swore his brain had turned to wax. The church, for its part, urged silence. The image of the monarch was sacred. To dwell on the corruption of his flesh was to risk scandal. And yet, the truth spread, not in official proclamations, but in the murmured horror of those who had seen what lay beneath the velvet and gold. But if death was the end of Carlos, it was only the beginning of something far greater and far more dangerous. His will had been prepared with the same desperation that had haunted his reign. In it, he named as his successor Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France. It was a choice meant to secure Spain's place in the balance of European power. Instead, it would ignite one of the largest wars the continent had ever seen. The ink on the will was barely dry before the great courts of Europe began to move their pieces. The Austrians claimed the throne by blood. The French claimed it by right of succession. The English and Dutch feared a united France and Spain would tip the scales toward tyranny. What Carlos left behind was not a kingdom at peace, but a chessboard covered in powder and waiting for a spark. Inside Madrid, the reaction was more intimate. For the people, Carlos had been a strange and distant figure, a monarch rarely seen in public, his frailty hidden behind curtains and ceremony. His death was met with a mix of sorrow, relief, and dread. Some mourned sincerely, others muttered that the curse was finally broken. But all understood the truth. The Habsburg age was over, and whatever came next would not be gentle. The funeral was a spectacle of shadow and gold. The body, dressed in state robes, lay in the great hall, surrounded by hundreds of candles whose flames guttered in the draught. The scent of beeswax and incense was overpowering, clinging to the tapestries and the mourners alike. Monks chanted for hours, their voices low and unbroken, while the court filed past, each bowing or curtsying in turn. Some swore the king's face had already begun to sink into itself, the features softening into an unrecognizable mask. Others said his eyes seemed to follow them, as though even in death Carlos was watching, still tethered to the palace he had rarely left. Beyond the palace walls, Europe waited for the inevitable. Troops were already moving toward the Pyrenees. Ships were being readied in English ports. In Vienna, envoys drafted letters declaring the French claim an insult to the Habsburg name. In Paris, Louis XIV prepared his grandson for a throne drenched in both wealth and instability. The War of the Spanish Succession, a war that would draw in nearly every major power on the continent, had begun before the king's body was even laid in the crypt. And so the story of Carlos II ended as it had been lived, not with triumph, but with fragility. His life had been a mirror of his dynasty's decline, a body too weak to bear its own crown, a line too entangled in its own blood to survive. The autopsy's findings would be whispered for generations, a macabre footnote in the annals of history. But the true legacy of Carlos II was not in the strange hollowness of his skull or the withered seed of his manhood. It was in the empire he left, fractured, coveted, and about to be torn apart by the very powers his ancestors had once ruled. Bridge to the epilogue, and so, with the tolling of the bells and the lowering of the velvet-draped coffin into the royal crypt, the last breath of the Spanish Habsburgs dissolved into the cold November air. But the silence did not last. Across Europe, the drums of war were already beating, and the ghost of Carlos II would linger, not in memory, but in the chaos his absence had unleashed. The ink was barely dry on the will when the air in Europe began to change. In a chamber lit by thin November sunlight, The testament of Carlos II was read aloud to the courtiers who had survived his reign. His voice was gone, his body cold in the crypt, but his final decision carried the force of a cannon shot. I name Philip of Anjou, grandson of the most Christian king, Louis XIV of France, as the heir to my crown and all the kingdoms of the Spanish monarchy. The words settled over the room like falling ash. In Versailles, Louis XIV's lips curved into the faintest smile. The Sun King, who had spent decades bending Europe to his will, now saw his grandson's future crowned with both Spain and the sprawling empire that stretched across the oceans. France rejoiced, bells rang, wine flowed, and poets recited verses predicting a golden age. But in Vienna, the reaction was steel and frost. The Habsburgs of Austria, cousins to the dead king, saw the will not as a bequest, but as a theft. To them, the Spanish crown was not a gift to be given. It was a birthright, one now slipping into the hands of their greatest rival. The map of Europe was already a web of fragile truces and old grudges. Carlos's death snapped the last thread holding them together. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and Savoy began whispering of alliances. France gathered its armies, knowing the ink on the treaties would dry faster than the blood to come. And so, in the winter of 1701, war began. Not over land newly conquered, but over an inheritance no man could truly claim without force. It was called the War of the Spanish Succession, but in truth, it was a war for balance, for supremacy, for the right to decide how the world itself would be carved. From the Low Countries to the hills of Italy, from the Pyrenees to the waters of the Atlantic, battlefields bloomed like poisoned flowers, drums pounded over the snow, muskets cracked in the mist, cannons thundered across valleys, their smoke mingling with the gray breath of winter. Yet beneath the roar of war was a silence no soldier could break. The silence left by the absence of the Spanish Habsburgs. For the dynasty that had ruled continents, the tragedy was not in the loss of territory or the siege of cities. It was that the end had come without a single enemy's sword piercing a royal heart. No assassin had struck in the night. No rival claimant had marched through the gates of Madrid in triumph. The fall had been slow, internal, an empire rotting from the core, while its marble facade still gleamed in the sun. In the ruined halls of the Alcazar, the war was a distant thunder. The great palace had burned in 1734, but even before the fire, its corridors had been fading into shadow. The scent of lavender, once scattered to mask the odors of sickness and decay, lingered faintly in the stone. A ghost of the days when Margarita had walked those halls in silks. It was here, years before, that a young Carlos had shuffled between chambers, supported by servants, while outside the city still believed their king would grow strong. It was here that marriages had been plotted, vows spoken, and nuptial chambers prepared, all in the name of preserving a line that was already too weak to stand. Now that line was gone. The marriage strategies that had once united kingdoms had, over generations, braided weakness to weakness, flaw to flaw. A chin that could barely close over its teeth, organs that shriveled before their time, bloodlines too narrow to sustain life. The very purity they worshipped had been the instrument of their undoing. As soldiers clashed on fields far from Madrid, the Spanish people felt the war in other ways. Taxes rose again and again. Ships brought back news not of silver from the New World, but of naval defeats. Grain grew scarce. Bread lines lengthened. In the taverns, men muttered about omens. Comets in the night sky, storms that broke the harvest, the strange silence of the king's tomb. Some claimed the ghost of Carlos still walked the palace at night, his steps dragging, his breath wheezing, as if seeking the air he could never produce. Meanwhile, in Vienna, Margarita's name was spoken only in private. She had died years before the war began, her body claimed by the same invisible hand that had gripped her brother's. Yet for those who had known her, the connection was impossible to ignore. Her decline had mirrored his, each a reflection of the other's fragility. If there was any justice, she was spared the sight of what became of the empire they had both been born to preserve. By 1704, the war had consumed much of Europe. Blenheim, Ramillies, Oudenarde, names that would be etched into history as turning points, were bought with the lives of thousands who had never set foot in Spain. Each battle shifted the balance, yet none ended the struggle. The irony was bitter. The Spanish crown was not so much fought over as fought through, a jewel used to justify years of slaughter. In Madrid, the court adapted to its new monarch. Philip of Anjou, now Philip V of Spain, arrived as both king and foreigner, the embodiment of the French alliance that had so unsettled Europe. His rule would outlast the war, but it would never erase the memory of what came before. The people still told stories of the last Habsburg king, not of his decrees or his victories, but of his ailments, his strangeness, the way his face seemed carved from wax. Carlos II became less a figure of politics than a cautionary tale. His life proof of the danger in blood, kept too pure, and in the quietest corners of the Alcazar, the scent of lavender remained. It clung to the stone even as the palace's great halls fell into disuse, as the war raged on beyond its walls. It was the smell of rooms where the air had been too still, where sunlight had filtered through curtains but never warmed the floor. It was the smell of an empire that had, in the end, sealed its own fate. When the War of the Spanish Succession finally ended in 1714, the treaties carved up not only territory, but influence, drawing new lines across the map of Europe. The Spanish Empire was smaller, its glory dimmed, but it still stood under a new dynasty, one that would never fully escape the shadow of the last. For the Habsburgs of Spain, there was no resurrection. Their end was absolute, their bloodline broken not by war but by the slow poison of their own making, and so the war closed over their memory like earth over a grave. Yet in the stone corridors of Madrid, in the imagined scent of fading lavender, the echo of their footsteps remains. The Spanish Habsburgs had ruled the world and destroyed themselves without an enemy's blade. It begins not in a palace, but in a laboratory. The light here is cold, sterile, not the golden glow of candlelit courts, but the white glare of modern science. A single microscope stands where once a throne might have been, its glass lenses bending the light to reveal what the naked eye cannot see. On the counter lies an old genealogical chart, its ink faded, but its lines unmistakable. A family tree so tangled it folds in upon itself. The names are the same ones whispered in the corridors of the Alcazar centuries ago. Margarita Teresa, Carlos II, Mariana, Philip, joined again and again by marriage contracts that were less about love and more about keeping the crown in familiar hands. Familiar. Far too familiar. The scientists trace the connections, each line looping back into the same small circle of blood. At first, it reads like a curiosity, a mathematical oddity. But when they calculate the inbreeding coefficient, the numbers grow unsettling. Carlos II, the last Spanish Habsburg, emerges not as a singular tragedy, but as the mathematical product of generations of deliberate narrowing. His genetic code was the echo of too few voices, the repetition of the same notes until the melody collapsed into a single strained tone. His jaw, the infamous mandibula Habsburga, was not a quirk of fate. It was the physical monument to decisions made long before his birth. In this cold modern light, the symptoms reveal themselves with merciless clarity. The protruding lower jaw, the inability to chew properly, to speak without effort, infertility so profound it was unlikely an heir could ever be conceived. The seizures, the digestive illnesses, the slow decay of organs that could not bear the weight of life, each was a thread in the tapestry of the Habsburg legacy, not embroidered in gold, but woven from the recessive genes passed from uncle to niece, cousin to cousin. The dynasty had called it purity. Nature called it weakness. For the Habsburgs, purity was power, an almost religious belief that the crown was not merely a political artifact, but a sacred object that could only be entrusted to those of the same blood. To mix it with the blood of others was to risk contamination, to dilute the divine right itself. And so the marriages were arranged like chess moves, but always within the same board. Spain and Austria traded sons and daughters across borders, each time pretending the pool was deeper than it was. The result was not the preservation of power, but its gradual suffocation. Geneticists of the 21st century look upon Carlos and Margarita not with the eyes of courtiers or ambassadors, but with the detached precision of medical historians. They measure the angle of the jaw in painted portraits. They compare descriptions from physicians' notes to the symptoms of modern disorders. They run simulations showing how recessive traits, harmless in diversity, become lethal when doubled and redoubled over generations. The verdict is inescapable. The Spanish Habsburgs did not fall to foreign invasion, to revolution, or to assassination. They fell to their own devotion to themselves. Historians have long argued over the causes of Spain's decline: the endless wars, the overextended empire, the bleeding of treasure into foreign hands. All of it true, all of it damaging. But the most destructive enemy was never across the border. It was inside the palace walls. It was inside the blood. And so, the story of Margarita and Carlos becomes something more than a chapter in royal gossip. It becomes a parable, not of romance or betrayal, but of biology. Margarita, married young to her uncle, carried the weight of expectation and the quiet burden of fragile health. Her body, like her brother's, bore the unseen scars of the genetic loop that had defined their family for generations. Her decline, gradual and polite, mirrored his collapse. Each step they took, from the gilded chapels to the echoing throne rooms, was accompanied by the silent ticking of a clock no one could reset. In modern classrooms, their portraits are projected on white screens side by side. Students see the silks, the jewels, the postures of command. And then they see the jawline, the eyes set deep beneath the brow, the mouth that does not close. The lecture is not about court intrigue, but about Mendelian inheritance, about the way traits pass from parent to child, gathering strength or fading away. The story is stripped of incense and candlelight, but it loses none of its tragedy. Yet for all the clinical detachment of science, there is something deeply human in this reckoning. The Habsburgs were not fools. They were prisoners of their own logic, bound to traditions that seemed to protect them even as they destroyed them. To question the bloodline was treason. To marry outside of it was to risk the throne itself. And so, they tightened the circle, believing they were fortifying the walls, never realizing that they were building a tomb. The warning is sharper now than it ever was in their own lifetimes. We know more about heredity. We understand the consequences of genetic isolation in plants, in animals, in people. We can map the invisible flaws long before they appear in flesh and bone. And yet, the temptation remains. In dynasties, in corporations, in any closed system where familiarity feels safer than the unknown. The lesson the Habsburgs left us is not only about marriage or medicine. It is about the danger of refusing to let the outside world in. In the quiet of the laboratory, the genealogical chart is rolled away. The scientists remove their gloves, wash their hands, and turn out the lights. The story of the Spanish Habsburgs is finished, but the echo of its truth remains. Blood can be a bond. Blood can be a prison. And sometimes, blood can be a noose. In 1700, the Habsburg crown passed to a new head, and the war began. But the deeper legacy, the one written in marrow in the fragile architecture of bone, would outlast any treaty. And in the shadows of palaces and laboratories alike, the question lingers: what other empires carry within them the seeds of their own destruction? The corridor is silent, not the hush of reverence, but the muffled stillness of a place that has seen too much and said too little. Once, these walls knew the rustle of silk skirts, the soft click of shoes over marble, the low murmur of voices bending around secrets. Once, the air here was saturated with the fragrance of Princess Margarita Teresa, lavender, laced with something warmer like sunlit honey. It was the scent of youth, of royal composure, of a life presented to the world as untouchable. Now the lavender is faint, barely a ghost clinging to the carved wood panels. The stone beneath is cold. The air tastes stale, perfume overwrought. It is the perfect epitaph for the Spanish Habsburgs. The dynasty had always understood appearances. They draped their sickness in silks, masked their weakness with crowns heavy enough to bow the head. They smiled for visiting ambassadors, toasted victories while armies bled, and performed their rituals in cathedrals gilded to blind the eye. No one was meant to see the trembling hands under the jeweled rings. No one was meant to hear the wheezing breath between the speeches. No one was meant to smell what lay beneath the lavender. But history, unlike the courtiers, does not avert its eyes. In the painted portraits, their faces are serene. But oil cannot capture the twitch in Carlos II's jaw when he tried to chew, or the shallow breaths that forced him to pause mid-sentence. In the official records, their bloodline is unbroken. But parchment cannot convey the aching truth of the bodies it described. They believed purity would preserve them. Instead, it corroded them from within. Margarita had carried her lavender into every corridor of the Alcazar. It was her armor. The scent clung to her gowns, her hair, even the linens of her bed. Courtiers claimed they could tell when she had passed through a hall minutes before, the air shifting from the damp heaviness of the palace to a sudden lightness, fleeting but unmistakable. To them, it was a mark of elegance. To her, it was an act of defiance, a way to remind herself that she was still alive in a world that treated her like a relic in a glass case. But perfume cannot change the body it adorns. And when her health began to falter, the lavender could not hide the scent of fever. Carlos learned the same lesson in his own way. After Maria Luisa's death, after the second marriage that brought no heir, after the feasts and blessings that rang hollow, the king began to cling to ritual with almost childlike desperation. He bathed in scented waters, burned incense until the smoke curled against the ceiling, surrounded himself with flowers that were replaced before they could wilt. It made the palace smell like devotion. It also made it smell like fear, because beneath the petals and prayers, the scent of decay was always waiting. The Habsburgs had not invented this illusion, they had perfected it. Royalty throughout history has been skilled in the art of masking rot. The Egyptians buried their pharaohs in gold, though the mummies inside were already turning to dust. The French Bourbons powdered their faces until the sores from smallpox disappeared under a chalky mask. Even now, in the marble halls of modern politics, weakness is hidden beneath tailored suits, rehearsed smiles, and the sterile scent of expensive cologne. Perfume overwrought. The phrase is older than the Habsburgs, and it will outlive them. But here in Madrid, the image had an almost religious intensity. The court believed in its own fictions. They believed the lavender meant health, the silk meant stability, the gold meant eternity. It is the oldest trick of power. When the body fails, strengthen the costume. And yet, costumes do not fool nature. When Carlos II died in 1700, the scent of flowers at his funeral was overwhelming. Visitors described the church as an ocean of fragrance, lilies, roses, lavender, and myrtle. But beneath it all, there was something else, the faint, sour whisper of what those flowers were meant to hide. His autopsy revealed truths no perfume could disguise. A heart the size of a peppercorn, intestines blackened and rotten, a body that had been a battlefield between his heritage and his survival. And heritage had won. In the Escorial, his tomb lies among the kings and queens who came before him, marble above, bone below. The epitaph calls him El Hechizado, the bewitched, a name that suggests magic, curses, forces beyond human control. But there was no sorcery here, only the slow arithmetic of blood. His fate had been written long before his birth, in the ink of marriage contracts and the whispered agreements of kings and queens. Centuries later, the lavender is gone from the Alcazar corridors. The palace itself is gone, lost to fire. But the idea, the image of perfume overwrought, remains. It lingers in the minds of historians who study the portraits, in the charts of geneticists mapping the family tree, in the quiet awe of visitors who stand before the Habsburg tombs and wonder how a dynasty that ruled continents could fall without a single decisive battle. The truth is that the war was fought inside them, and they lost. Yet the warning is not theirs alone. Even now there are families, nations, corporations, and dynasties that seal themselves off, trusting only those who share their blood, their creed, their history. They mistake the comfort of familiarity for strength. They think the walls will protect them. But walls, like bloodlines, can trap as easily as they can defend. In the end, the Habsburg story is not just about kings and queens, but about the universal temptation to hide weakness rather than confront it, to layer scent over stench, to patch silk over rot, to crown the coffin and call it a throne. They teach us that appearances may hold for a season, but seasons change, and when the air grows still and the flowers begin to fade, the truth will seep through the cracks. In the corridor where we began, the air is empty now. The lavender has long since dispersed into the dust. Only the memory remains, the knowledge that behind the fragrance was something far older and far less forgiving. Carlos II was not the most unfortunate because he died without an heir. He was the most unfortunate because he never had a choice. The Song of the Habsburgs was written before he was born. He was only the final note. And if you stand long enough in the quiet, if you let the world fall away, you might almost smell it, faint, lingering, inevitable. The end, coming closer.